Okay, hey everyone, and welcome to this week's CEPR-VDEV webinar with Oriana Bandiera, who's going to talk to us why poor people stay poor. Before we let Oriana get going, I'm just going to give you some rules or some introductions for how we do it, and maybe by now many of you have joined us. So the seminar is 1 hour and 15 minutes. Oriana is going to present for 1 hour, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. And at that point, we're going to open up the mic for participants who wants to ask the questions, and you can then raise your hand, and we will let you in to ask the question to Oriana. During the 1 hour that Oriana is presenting, if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A section. And we will make sure to take a couple of pauses during the talk, and I will pass on these questions if they're clarifying to the speaker. And if you think there's a good question, you're also free to vote up that question as well. And we have done our homework and looked at Oriana's slides. So if there are some questions that we know is coming later in the talk, we're just going to move that to responded questions, and Oriana is going to cover that later on. So this is it for instructions. This is the last VDEV CPR seminar for the fall. And then we're going to take a little bit of a break for the job market and let everyone attend our younger scholars who's going to be having interviews. And then we're resuming on March 2nd. And then we're going to have every other week seminars again until the beginning of June. And we're going to post the schedule for this later on, so you're going to see that as well. But for now, super happy to have you here, Oriana, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Let me just share the right file. Okay, so again, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So this paper is co-authored with Clare, Robin, Maitreesh, and Anton, who's actually here today. So he'll also be helping out with questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'm not sure how it works. So let me see if this starts. Okay, starting point is that if we look at the poor in poor countries, lack of employment is not the issue. Most of the global poor work, especially in the poorest countries. So the problem with poverty is not as much the lack of jobs, but rather the type of jobs that the poor do. Okay? So the fact that by definition, labor is the only endowment of the poor, understanding the link between jobs and poverty is of the utmost importance. So the question that we ask in this paper is a classic chicken and egg question, which is basically whether the poor stay poor because they're only able to do bad jobs, or whether they only do bad jobs because they're poor. And as you can imagine, the answer to this question is fundamental to understand which policies should be implemented to fight poverty. And many of you will have already recognized the type of circular reasoning that's associated with the idea of poverty traps. Okay? So poverty traps or multiple steady states have a long history, both in macro and micro development theory. Okay, starting from Rosenstein-Rodan in 1943, all the way to my co-author and colleague Maitreesh Ghatak 4 years ago, there is a long tradition of theory papers that look at the possibility of poverty traps. Now, empirical investigations include calibrations with cross-country data, structural approaches, and micro-studies with observational data. Okay. Recent field experiments also relate to big push approaches, suggest that these type of approaches work for reducing poverty. So all of these points to something consistent with poverty traps, but not quite the evidence of the existence of a poverty trap. So just to make things precise to start with, imagine that you have two people, one on the higher dot and one on the lower dot. If I put axis, it might be more convenient. Let's say that on the horizontal axis, you have assets today, and on the vertical axis, you have assets at some point in the future. Okay, so one possibility for why people find themselves in two different equilibria is that one is less productive than the other. Okay, so the lower person or lower country has a productivity parameter AL, and the higher country has a productivity parameter AH, with AH larger than AL. Of course, that's one possibility. The alternative is that they both have exactly the same productivity, a common parameter A, but the production function that they face is not concave everywhere. Rather, it's got this S shape or a discontinuity somewhere. And what this can produce is two equilibria for two people who are otherwise identical. So the L person in this case has started somewhere below the K hat point and ends up at the KL equilibrium, and the other person must have started somewhere to the right and ends up at the high equilibrium. Now, finding the answer is key for policy, because in the first world, in the concave world, people with the same productivity will always reach the same steady state. So it doesn't really matter where they start, they will always climb out of poverty. In this world, the people who do not climb out of poverty is because they don't have the skills to do so. So in this world, anti-poverty policies must support consumption. In the second world, wealth at birth determines the steady state. In this world, there is no way out without a big push, because if the transfers don't push you past that K hat threshold, you're always going to slide back into poverty. Okay? The positive side of this is that a big enough transfer will eliminate the need for future transfers forevermore, because once you are above the threshold on your own, you will converge to the high steady state. What we do in this paper is that we use the randomized control trial of a large asset transfer program in Bangladesh and trace the effects of over 11 years to test directly for the existence of a poverty trap. And then we estimate a structural model of occupational choice to back out the value of the misallocation, if any. So some of you, maybe many of you, will have already seen the program, because we have a previous paper in which we evaluated. This program takes place in the poorest region of Bangladesh. The sample originally is 23,000 households in 1,300 villages in northern Bangladesh. This is the poorest area of one of the poorest countries. And what we do is that we collect a 5-year panel over the period of 11 years. We actually also have a small front survey in 2020 to see how they were coping with COVID. I can tell you that towards the end. And we plan to go back to the field next year. Well, let's see how the pandemic evolves. Next year or the year after next, to keep following them. So in 2007, we did a census, and the census covered 100,000 households. That formed the sampling frame for our first wave, which was collected in 2007. And that was before the program was implemented. The program, which I will tell you in more details in the next slide, was implemented right after the baseline. And then we observed people 2 years, 4 years, 7 years, and 11 years later. Now, in between 2011, 2014, actually in 2013, the program was also implemented in the control villages, because that was a randomized rollout. It wasn't an exclusion. Now, let me tell you some facts about these settings, which will be important to understand how we can identify poverty traps here. So the first is that the poor stay poor. Only in the control villages, only 3% of poor households reach, after 4 years, median level of so the median of the middle class in terms of assets. So you basically are born poor and stay poor. There is a hierarchy of jobs that's correlated with poverty. Okay? The poor are casually employed in agriculture and domestic services, whereas the rich are self-employed in livestock rearing and land cultivation. And this hierarchy means that better jobs require productive assets. And productive assets is really what sets apart the rich and the poor. The richer classes in our villages have on average 94 times as many productive assets as the poor. And it's not just a matter of numbers. So it's not a matter of like the poor households having 1 chicken and the rich household having 100 chicken, but rather there is a hierarchy of assets, and the richer households own more expensive, indivisible assets, such as livestock and land. So this is a descriptive table. This is probably better to illustrate how striking the difference in asset is. So the other lines on this graph are the factor of consumption. So the rich consume food consumption twice as much as the poor. Savings and non-business assets, so mostly household assets, 30 times as big. Productive assets are about 94 times as big. Occupational choice reflects the difference in asset ownerships. What we do here is that we plot the log of baseline productive assets on the horizontal axis, and then the share of total hours spent in these different occupations. And you see that the very richest people towards the right of this graph only do land cultivation, and the very poorest people mostly do maid, casual labor in agriculture, casual labor outside agriculture. Okay? More assets, as I was telling you earlier, mean more expensive assets. So people who have a very low value of productive assets, the people on the left of this graph, mostly own poultry. Then as they get bit richer, they start owning goats. As they get bit richer, they start owning cows. And finally, the very rich own land. Very rich is always very relative here. Poor people stay poor. This is the first 3 waves, and this is the total value of assets in a log in the first 3 waves. And you see there's basically no change. Okay, those who have little assets to start with have little assets 4 years later, and so on. And finally, if we look at the distribution of productive assets in these villages, this turns out to be bimodal. Okay? This is essential, I mean, this is necessary but not sufficient for the existence of a poverty trap, because it suggests that there are 2 equilibria, one at log 0.6 and the other one around log 0.1. Now, how do we test for the existence of poverty traps? The ultra-poor program was randomly allocated across villages, actually across areas, branch of the BRAC offices, which comprise more than 1 village. The beneficiaries are the poorest women in these villages. The program transfers a cow and training on how to take care of the cow. The value of the asset is enormous. It's worth 1 year of per capita consumption, which is about 5 times the average microloan that BRAC gives in these areas. And contrary to the loan, it doesn't have to be repaid within a week. This is a grant. It's a gift from BRAC to the beneficiaries. Now, entirely by chance, I wish we could claim that we were clever enough to think about this, but this is entirely by chance. The program moves all the beneficiaries, which is around 4,000 people, from the low mode precisely into the lowest density area of the distribution. Now, the reason this is important is that if there is a poverty trap, that is a threshold, that threshold will be in that area, because by definition, the poverty threshold is an unstable equilibrium, is repellent. If you get close to it from the right, you escape away from poverty. If you get close to it from the left, you fall back into poverty. And that also illustrates why it's so difficult to find evidence for poverty traps in observational data. Because by the mere fact that that equilibrium is unstable, you never observe people in its neighborhood. So you can't observe how people behave around that neighborhood. Luckily for us, the program places a lot of people bang in the middle there. This means that we can use pre-existing differences, tiny differences in wealth, a baseline, to see how people respond to the transfer and basically plot out a transition equation. This is after the transfer. You see, after the transfer, in control, people stay where they are because the poor stay poor. In treatment, which is the red line, you get a bump of people that are pretty much half of the people who were at the low mode get moved to the low density point. This shows that the argument that I was making earlier, that shocks of this magnitude are very rare. These are from control villages, and this plots the share of households that experiences a change in low productive assets of each of these sizes. So you see that the vast majority experience no change. Then most of them experience very small changes. This is the value of the transfer. The red line is the value of the transfer. There is fewer than 5% of control households who experience a change of that magnitude. So that is, again, to make the point that you very rarely observe people in the hollow part of the distribution, because it doesn't happen by chance. So poverty traps and differential productivity are observationally equivalent in steady state. However, they produce different transition equations. Because we shock the system, we put people around the hollow part of the distribution, we can estimate the transition equation, that is how they respond after they've been put there. And a necessary condition for the poverty traps is that the transition equation is not concave. Okay? We can test this using the fact that beneficiaries differ slightly in baseline assets. I will have some identification slides later. We'll exploit this to estimate the transition equation from 2007 and 2011, and then we will test the prediction of the poverty trap model following them 11 years down the line. So we identify the threshold using the first 4 years of data, and then we test whether the people who were above the threshold in 2011 behave differently in 2018. So identification is based on differences in initial assets that are tiny relative to the transfer, but they're clearly not randomized. Okay, they just happen to be there. So we do two things to allay concerns of identification. The first is that there could be just endogenous shocks. So it could be that people who have slightly higher capital at baseline experience larger increase in capital subsequently. Because the placement of the program is randomized, we can use the control villages to test for the existence of these shocks. That is, we can compare two people with the same K0 in treatment and control and see whether their delta K is the same. There could be an endogenous response to the program, that is, K0 could be correlated with how people respond to the program. Okay? Of course, we can't use control for this because there is no program in control. So we can use different sources of variation to compare people with the same K0. once we get there, I'll tell you how we do this, but we will be able to compare two people with exactly the same initial capital, some in villages where that initial capital puts them past the threshold, and some in villages where it doesn't. Let me show you.
Oriana, I'm going to interrupt you and ask a couple of clarifying or a couple of questions. So the first one is, what do you mean by middle class or rich here in this paper?
So the wealth classes were defined by the villagers themselves. In order to find the beneficiaries for the program, BRAC ran a rural participatory assessment exercise where, I don't know how familiar people are with this, but basically they get around all the households in the village and they get them to rank all the other households, including themselves, into 4 bins: poor, near poor, middle class, and upper class. So this is all very relative. If you look at the upper classes in these villages, they're still quite poor by any standard.
Okay, and then 2 more questions. So from Frank Schilbach, could other constraints in addition to the credit constraint be binding as well, such as hope, confidence, attention, entrepreneurial spirit, Absolutely. And so on? And this might be affected by assets or cash transfers in additional features of the ultra portfolio.
Absolutely. So we are completely in agreement with that. We cannot test for these constraints, but what we can tell is that if the asset transfer unlocks a poverty trap, for sure the binding constraint was assets. There could be additional constraints that strengthen this mechanism, but we cannot identify those separately. But the fact that, well, I kind of anticipate the results, but the fact that the asset, relaxing the asset constraint solves the problem suggests that the asset constraint was binding in the first place.
And then how should we think about the fact that a cow is a very specific type of asset? So it's very liquid and not separable, and it needs some types of skills to complement it. So in principle, in a poverty trap model, just giving cash should do the trick. But is this then a lower bound effect, or how do you think about this?
So kind of the best answer to this will be available in a couple of months, hopefully, because we ran exactly the same program in Pakistan, where we randomized one arm where we gave them the choice of cash. Now, everybody who had the choice of cash chose cash over the cow. But then, with the cash, most of them bought a cow. So we will find out soon what the difference is. I think probably that tells you that they don't value the training so much. These people were given cow with training. More in general, of course, I don't think that poverty traps everywhere in the world can be solved by giving people a cow. But the equivalent of a cow is the capital that you cannot afford to buy. So in most circumstances, this will be human capital. If you think about it, the equivalent in a poor family who has a very smart daughter is being able to pay for university education. Right? So very it's not good. Giving a cow.
Thanks, Oriana. And now you gave us a reason to continue look at this study later on as well.
Very good. So this is how the 2 transition equations look like. So the one on the left is without the poverty trap. The one on the right is with the poverty trap. So on the left, basically, the higher your capital, the less the accumulation of capital in the following period. And on the right, you have that S-shaped function. Now, with a great feat of computer programming, this is what the data looks like. So let me blow that up. This is the estimated transition equation from our data. Okay. We have on the horizontal axis productive assets in 2007. On the vertical axis, productive assets in 2011. So this transition equation is clearly not concave. Actually, our colleagues at the LSE, Tatiana Komarova and Javier Hidalgo, have developed a test for non-parametric shapes, and we reject the null of concavity with p-value of 0. So it's clearly not concave, and it intersects the 45-degree line at 2.34. If you estimate it as a polynomial of degree 3, you get a very close number. Okay, you get 2.36. Now, K is unstable by definition. The people below K hat lose K. The people above K hat gain it. But that you can see from the figure as well. Okay, everywhere above the K hat, the assets in 2011 are higher than the assets in 2007, and below is the other way around. In control villages, if we try to estimate a transition equation, this is what we get. So that is basically the difficulty of identifying poverty traps with observational data. You never observe people in that part of the threshold, and thus in that part of the distribution where you have the threshold, and you get one steady state, which is the low mode of the distribution of productive assets that you saw earlier. What does the difference in assets correspond to? Well, here is the value, the unit value of many assets. And here is the difference between being above the threshold and below the threshold. It corresponds roughly, I think this is, sorry, I'm sure that this is wrong, because it corresponds to the value of a rickshaw or a plow. So I think probably that is, no, sorry, that's the motorized one, is the cart or a plow. That is the difference that it makes to be above or below the threshold. Now, it cannot be explained by shocks correlated with baseline capital. That is, if you run that same regression, that is comparing capital in period t+1 to capital in period t, depending on whether you're above or below the threshold, you see that in treatment villages, people above the threshold accumulate capital. In control villages, there is no difference. If anything is negative, but is very small and precisely estimated. You can put them in the same regression and do a diff in diff, and you get the same exact result. Now, identification. So you might worry that this difference, this small difference in productive assets is correlated with all sorts of things. And in particular, it might be correlated with the way people respond to the program. So what we do to allay that concern is that we use the fact that in some villages, having a cow gives more income than other villages. And this is due to the fact that some villages are closer to markets than others. So we estimate predicted earnings using all the other wealth classes. And then we split the villages in two. Those where the predicted earnings from a cow are below the median, and those where they are above the median. Now, we estimate two transition equations now. The red one is above the median, and the blue one is below the median. And you see that they have a very similar shape, but the position of the threshold is different. Because intuitively, in order to escape the trap, you need a lower level of initial wealth if the earnings from the assets are higher. But that also means that we can run the same regression putting K0 fixed effects, so allowing everybody with the same level of wealth to be treated the same, and then just use the differences in threshold rather than the differences in K0 to identify the poverty trap. An alternative is to use individual variation. And what we do here is that we use the dependency ratio, which tells you not how much money you can make, but how much money you can save out of the income that you derive from the cow. Because in order to accumulate assets from one period to the other, you need to be able to save. So a beneficiary who has 5 young children and an elderly parent can save less than a beneficiary who has no elderly parents and 2 children. Okay? So again, we split people above and below the median, and we find 2 thresholds. When we use the variation in thresholds, we get exactly the same number. Okay? So you might argue in various ways, and we have a list of arguments which I can put forward for why either the dependency ratio is not exogenous or the differences in earnings is not exogenous. But no matter what you do, whether you use the variation in baseline capital or the variation due to the difference in earnings or the variation due to the difference in dependency ratio, the effect of being above the threshold on capital growth is exactly the same. It's always 30% more. Okay? And you can also use the different thresholds as placebos, because being above the low threshold should have no effect, because the low threshold does not apply to people with a high threshold. And that's what we see here. So now that we've identified this threshold, I maybe stop here in case there are other questions, otherwise I keep going. Keep going?
I think you can keep going, yes.
Okay, good.
I'll stop you maybe later on if there's things coming up.
So now this is the threshold identified from the 4-year change, right? From 2007 to 2011, we see this S-shaped transition equation, which finds this spot of k hat, where people above k hat accumulate and people below decumulate. Now, the true test of a poverty trap is what happens in the long run. That is, do the people who were above k hat in 2007 keep growing after 2011, and do the people below the threshold keep falling backward? Now, this is the Diffin-Diff coefficient of the difference in productive assets between people who are above the threshold and below the threshold in 2007 and different survey waves. And you see that these are the results that we knew up to 2011. They were accumulating more assets. That difference grows. By 2018, that is 11 years after the transfer, the difference is more than double. Okay? And this is due to the composition of assets. So they accumulate cows at the beginning, but then they manage to save enough to buy land. So this is due to the fact that the people above the threshold are on a spiral of savings and reinvestment up to the point that when we see them 11 years later, some of them have bought land. The average gap in consumption increases. Interestingly, it's negative at the beginning because of the difference in savings. Okay? But then it grows over time. And this was at the beginning when we were doing the evaluation of this program, people who used the $190 a day poverty line were arguing that the program does not work because it doesn't increase consumption. Well, it turns out that it doesn't increase consumption because people are transiting to a new steady state, and so they're saving instead of consuming. This is the gap in hours worked. It stays constant. People work more. And in particular, the entire gap in hours worked comes from livestock and land cultivation. So the important thing here to notice is that this is not just an accumulation of assets. This is a poverty trap which is linked to occupational choice. Okay? So what we observe here is the fact that having these assets or not having the assets makes the difference between staying in casual labor or being able to move into self-employment. And that's what's driving all the results. Now, over a period of 11 years, there's many things that change. Notably, people get older. I can tell you that because I started working on this precisely 11 years, well, now it's 14 years ago. I was there when we did the baseline, and over 11 years, things change, okay? So the asset dynamics that we observe reflect two things, reflect convergence to a steady state, as well as aging, okay? But for people below the threshold, both go in the same direction. As people age, they start accumulating assets, and because they are below the threshold, they accumulate assets. But for people above, the two forces go in opposite directions. The fact that you're growing because you're above the threshold makes you accumulate. The fact that you're growing old makes you accumulate. Okay? So we can split the above sample into older and younger. And those who are above the threshold and are younger to start with are 20 percentage points more likely to grow assets by year 11. And this is the below the threshold and above the threshold, the different percentiles for the youngest.
So, Oriana, maybe I'll stop you here with a couple of questions. So one is on, a key assumption of these tests is that equilibrium points do not change over time. So how do we know that that's the case?
Because they didn't for the previous, if you take the history of the village, say the 4 years before, as a sign of what would happen 4 years later, we saw that if you draw the distribution of asset, it will be the same year after year, if you draw it in control. I showed you at the very beginning, I don't dare go back all the way there in the slides because then it would take me forever to come back. But at the beginning, I showed you a histogram of asset ownership in 3 waves, which were 4 years apart, of the ultra poor, the middle class, and the rich in control villages. And you could see that it was absolutely flat. So in this type of economy, there's not much changing. Once you account for prices changes, the real value of assets remains the same.
Thank you. So there are a couple of more questions. So one is related to whether you see changes in internal migration. So when households buy land, do children stay on the land and work on it, and hence further increase the return to this investment?
So the children is a very important aspect of this, because the intergenerational transmission of poverty, this is a very immobile society. So if you're born in poverty, you stay in poverty. But then if your mother gets a cow when you're just born, or when you're 10, does it make a difference? And that's what we're working on now, actually. And we observe, I can give you a preview, we observe an improvement in health of kids who were in utero or under the age of 2 when the mother was given the transfer. There's no improvement in health for older children. There is an improvement in schooling for children who were under the age of 11 when the transfer was given. There is no improvement in schooling for older children. And we are now following in what happens once they join the labor market.
So this, you just answered the second question, which was actually about what is the effect on kids' education. And they were wondering if, you see reductions in investments for education for older kids, but you're saying you don't see that.
No, we don't see that, because although there is a slight increase in the hours that the kids help with the animals, this is very small, so it doesn't preclude attending school.
Thank you.
So we don't see a drop in education. To the contrary, we see an increase.
Thanks, Oriana.
And migration, sorry, I didn't answer the question on migration. So these women, by the way they're selected to take part in the program, they're kind of stuck. They're mostly women who don't have an able husband. So, and they have young children when they're treated in 2007. So they are fairly immobile, which also explains why attrition rates are extremely low in these samples. We have like a 10% attrition over or maybe 13% over the entire period. So it's not the right population to migrate. You can imagine that an escape from poverty would include some urban migration, and maybe their kids will, but they're too young for us to tell now.
So another question is if you could achieve the same results with cheap loans, such as the Borga program and land rental as you did with the livestock.
So loans have the main issue of microloans, at least, of being tiny. And you've seen here that you need a lot to go past the threshold. The very last slide will compute the share of households. We'll show you the share of households that can be brought past the threshold for every level of transfer. So loans have the problem of size and the problem that they have to be repaid very quickly. There is a variant of this program where they give the cow as a mortgage. So they repay. After 1 year, I think they start repaying, and they use the cow as a collateral. But this is a version of the program that's given to people who are kind of richer than these extremely poor people. I think that a very long-term loan contract could work in this setting, even for the ultra poor. But it would have to be very long-term. And I don't know how profitable. I think probably not very profitable, but relative to giving cows for free, some of the costs could be recuperated, I think.
Thank you. So we'll let you move on.
So the final thing that we do is to try to put some numbers on this. So as I said, the key result here is not as much that you give people a cow, they get more cows, but rather the fact that they change the job that they do. They go from doing casual maid and casual laborers in agriculture to be self-employed. So what we do here is that we use a structural estimation of a model of occupational choice to estimate individual level productivity and cost of effort. And then based on those, determine the optimal occupations for each person, each beneficiary here, in the absence of capital constraints. And that will allow us to quantify the misallocation baseline. Okay, so the unique feature of this setting is that we observe the beneficiaries doing both jobs. Okay? You very rarely observe this because normally people sort in the job that they're best at, or if they face a constraint, they keep facing that constraint. But here we observe them a baseline where they could do nothing but wage labor. So everybody's doing wage labor, so we can estimate how productive they are in that. And then because of a feature of the program, basically BRAC asked them to keep the cow for 2 years. And after 2 years, they could do whatever they wanted with it. So at year 2, we observe almost everybody working with the cow. So we can estimate productivity both in wage labor and in cow rearing for everybody, for every beneficiary. Okay? Then we do that, and then we predict what the optimal choice should be. And then we evaluate the model using both the 4-year data and the 11-year data as well. So the idea is that assume that the ultra poor had the same assets as the people who are at the upper mode, and we use the model to estimate optimal occupation. There is 3 types of occupation. You can do wage work, livestock rearing, or mixing. The pink is the actual occupation that we observe, and the green is the optimal. That is what they should be doing given their parameters. And you see that there is a massive mismatch here. Their optimal occupation is livestock rearing for 90% of them, but everybody does wage work. Then we compute the payoff at the optimal occupation and compute the payoff at the actual occupation. The difference between the two is the value of the misallocation. And our estimate suggests that it makes no sense not to give cows. And this, coming back to the question, does the program pay off? There must be a way of making these returns pay off, because the total misallocation value is 15 million per annum. The total cost of transfers that's needed to bring everybody above the threshold is 1 million paid once, and that's it. Now, the model suggests that everybody's misallocated and that the value of misallocation is way larger than the cost of eliminating the trap. But I think the coolest thing I think about this model is that we can simulate all sorts of things that could destroy the effect of the program. Like a typical concern is now all these people are rearing cows, so there is many more cows, so the price of milk collapses and the effects are much smaller. So we can see what happens when we allow for general equilibrium price effects. We can see what happens if we double the wage rate, will more people stay in wage labor, or if we make wage labor less painful. And sorry, I thought that I had the numbers there. Basically, nothing changes in the following sense, that in order for general equilibrium effects to kill the gains of the program, so for the program actually to break even, so that the cost is 1 million and the gain is 1 million, you need prices to fall by 90%. So if the price of the product of the cow is, the price effect is such that the price falls by 96%, then the benefit equates the cost. Doubling a wage rate attracts a lot of people into wage labor, so it wouldn't be 96% misallocated, it would be maybe 60% misallocated. But the value of the misallocation will be more or less the same because the distribution is very skewed. So there are some people who are really very productive at cow rearing who should do cow rearing. And halving the disutility of wage labor has the same effects. Now, let me finish with that.
So let me take a question on this misallocation before I let you end. So one of the participants are saying that to say it's misallocation, there must be an inefficiency. So does the data say that poor people are more productive at raising the cow than rich people if they're given the very same asset?
So I don't know if they are more productive than the rich people, but they clearly are more productive at rearing cows than being wage laborers. And there's clearly a constraint here, a binding constraint, which is the credit constraint. They cannot buy cows on their own. But once you give them a cow, those who are above the threshold keep working with it, and they do very well.
Thanks.
Thank you. So this last slide, I already introduced it earlier. What it does is that basically for every transfer value, here normalized as a share of average annual per capita consumption, we compute the share of households which will be brought past the threshold by that transfer. So what that means is that with the BRAC transfer, we get about 66%, 2/3 of households above the threshold and 1/3 below. Now, the typical microloan is about here. Its value is less than 20% of annual per capita consumption. The share of households that will be brought above the threshold by that type of loan is 20%. This is, I think, consistent with recent findings of the evaluation of microfinance that suggest that people who already have a business, who are on the cusp of expanding but can't expand, thanks to the microloan, they do much better. But the vast majority of people, they don't change their occupation at all once they're given a microloan. The value of the payment of NREGA on average is similar. And these are the ultra-poor programs that have been evaluated, the pilots of the ultra-poor programs that have been evaluated by Abhijit and co-authors in the recent science publication. And you see that they're all poorer than BRAC. The one that's most similar in terms of results is also the one that's closest, if you exclude Honduras that had some implementation problem, which is West Bengal in India. And this is Chris Blattman's transfer for micro entrepreneurs. And we should put more because in the meantime, there have been more programs being implemented of this nature. But basically what this illustrates is that the classic approach, microfinance, cannot do anything to solve this problem because relative to the size of assets that people have to start with, the microloan is way too small to push people past the threshold. So I think we've learned that people are not unable, rather they lack the required capital. And the key conclusion is that we really should focus on production and jobs, that is to enable people to escape poverty on their own, because many of them have the talent to do so. And a one-off large transfer might be painful, but it's way cheaper than propping up consumption in the long run. I'm done.
Thanks, Eliana. This is great. So there is questions in the chat, but I suggest that we open the floor and people can ask questions themselves. So if you want to ask questions, please just raise your hand and we will unmute you and you can ask the question directly to Eliana. So I see that Annette John has a question and I'm going to unmute you and you can ask the question directly to Oriana. Sorry.
Yeah. Hello, Oriana. This is fascinating. Thank you very, thank you very much. So I'm just wondering whether.
No, sorry. I'm just saying I can't see
I'm just wondering whether an alternative explanation of the S shape that you see is not that the cow gets you across a threshold level of capital K star, but simply that the cow itself needs complementary capital to be productive. So then the S shape holds by construction, because you're giving people an asset which is only productive if they already have capital. So suppose the cow needs a shed and only those who can afford the shed will thrive. But instead, suppose you hold the asset value constant, but this time the asset is self-contained. So suppose you only give them a pig, but you also give them a pig pen. So just the asset package by itself is usable and they can be productive with it. Under that explanation, people might thrive independent of the starting level K because the asset packet already is self-contained. Would that be consistent?
No, because you see that in villages where the earnings from the cows are higher, what they need is less. So if it were a matter of having the pen or the cart to bring the produce to the market, we should observe the same threshold everywhere.
Yes.
So I think it's a combination. I mean, there certainly are complementarities, but I don't think it's specific to the cow. I think you have to have enough to overcome that threshold.
I didn't quite catch it. You observed that if they have less, they do better?
No, so in villages, we use the earnings of the middle classes and the rich people to predict how much each cow produces in annual income in different villages. Mm-hmm. And when we do that, you find that in villages where the cow yields a higher income, the threshold for escaping poverty is much lower.
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
So it's not like the fixed presence of a pen or a cart that makes you escape. It's not the bundle.
Okay, thank you.
Work.
Thank you. And next we have Miguel Espinosa that I'm now going to allow to talk.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Miguel.
Yeah, hi, Oriana. So amazing material. Thank you very much for sharing it. I just wanted to know a bit more on the potential spillovers that the program had. I can expect that, such a big shock, I might share some of this extra income to families and neighbors, and what would be the general equilibrium effect of that? Thank you.
So, thank you. So in our previous paper where we evaluate the program, actually the reason why we collected data on these households, every class in the villages, was to see the spillover effects. And so we found that because the beneficiaries stop working as wage laborers, the equilibrium wage increases by 10%. And that is the only price externality that we find. Because the cows, the transfer is one cow. And the rich people in the village have herds of like 50 cows. So in terms of the number of cows transferred as a share of the total cows in the village, it's a very small percentage. So that's why prices are not affected. But with the model, we can simulate what would happen where prices fall by any amount that you want. And they would have to fall by an enormous amount, 90%, to basically make this non-profitable.
Wonderful, thank you.
Related to that question, wouldn't these make people in the control group to stick to wage/unproductive labor? I mean, if the wages increase, then the people who don't receive a cow are more likely to stay as wage laborers, and that makes them stay in the low level equilibrium.
Okay, so the randomization is done at the branch level, where the branch is the area the branch serves. So most of the wage benefits accrue to villagers or people just outside the village. They don't reach the control villages. But in any case, even if they did, a 10% increase in wage is minuscule relative to the income increase that you can have if you switch from wage labor to cow rearing. Actually, with the model, we also simulate that. We say, what would happen if the wage were to double? And you see that there is a double, so not 10%. You see that there is a group of people that would be actually better at staying in casual labor. Not everybody is born to raise cows.
Thank you very much, Miguel and Gianmarco. So next one to ask a question is Mohammed Basal. I'm opening up now, and then you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Oriana.
Hi.
Thanks for the very interesting paper. How are you doing?
I'm good. How about yourself? This is basically a reunion.
Yes, that's it.
How are you, Mohammed?
So I'm a bit puzzled with this lack of sensitivity to the change in prices. and like you need huge price reductions in order to offset the effects. And I'm having two hypotheses here. One is whether these households are having a large share of own consumption, and that's why you don't see price sensitivity in the results. The second hypothesis is since these are small livestock farmers, their share of milk production or other kind of livestock production is very low. And therefore, you do not have in your data a large change in supply of livestock products. And if that large shock happens, then you might get into bottlenecks in the supply chain, like you need refrigerators, milk processing units, etc. And in the absence of those, you might get like a smaller price reductions to offset your results. What do you think of these?
Absolutely. So factually, they are tiny producers relative to the bigger producers in the same village. So that's why we don't observe a change in price. What we were doing in the model was simulating a collapse of revenue. Okay, so which could come from the fact that prices go down or because, as you say, capacity constraints start binding. That was a simulation that it would take basically a huge drop for the program not to be profitable. But in practice,
I understand that, but
yeah.
I understand that, but since the model is basically estimated from the data and you don't have such large shocks in the data, I'm wondering whether that's going to impact the simulation as well.
You mean, of course, we have a parameter that stands for, that multiplies revenue, right? So we scale that down. What you're saying is that it would change the parameters of the production function as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what you're saying is like, we can't use these parameters to estimate what would happen.
Yes, and if you also may comment on the first hypothesis as well, the share of own consumption.
Yeah. So own consumption, no, that doesn't matter for this because it's the value. Okay, so it's not the market value, it's how much the production is worth. Either you consume it or you sell it is all the same. But I think what you're saying is that this model cannot be used to simulate an enormous increase in production because the parameters that we estimate are estimated from a small scale livestock rearing. And that's correct. Like every structural model, you have to believe the assumption of the models. If the parameters change, you cannot do any simulation. So this is conditional on these parameters being correct. If the general equilibrium effect messes up the parameters, then you're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm now going to open up the floor for Albert Nkata. So you are now unmute. You need to unmute yourself. No. We can't hear you. So, Albert, why don't you write the question in the Q&A and we will bring it up here. So you still get your question answered. Okay. So we'll wait for Albert's question to come in. Are there other questions? Please raise your hand. I'm going to open for Peter Cernez.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Oriana. Fascinating presentation. So, could you shed light on to what extent you think this is a very specific group, and so the fact that they are less likely or can't migrate, does that suppress a number of other options that have high returns? that forces them to really believe in this option that is the way out. It doesn't take away any of the strength and the richness of the results, but it does. It would affect the comparison with other programs.
No, absolutely. I think, the general point that we want to make is that it is possible, if there is a sufficiently large transfer, to enable people to change occupation and escape poverty on their own. Now, in this particular setting, they had no choice but to basically do what the richer women in these villages do, which is tending cows and cultivating land. In another setting or another population, the way out might be to move to the city. But the main principle is the same. So if you apply this to poor areas of London, probably the way out is to study, to get vocational training or to go to college. But the principle is the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But what would help is to say more about the possible chances for escaping that they have left. Right? Is this the only way they have left? And so are they forced to do, not forced, but in a way, they're going to be more focused to take this way than anything else if there's nothing else left, right?
Yes. And that's maybe why in Pakistan, as I mentioned at the beginning, everybody who was given the choice between this program and the equivalent in cash took the cash. Yeah. Because maybe people know better what to do with the cash.
Thanks, that's great, thanks.
Right.
Sorry, I couldn't switch on my camera.
That's okay.
Thank you, Peter. Other questions, please feel free to raise your hands and ask your questions. In the meantime, I'm gonna actually bring up some questions that was, Alain de Genris were suggesting that you need a complementary intervention to increase elasticity of demand for milk, like Danone, as a suggestion.
Yes, that would help. It wouldn't help getting people out of the trap, because if they lack the capital to buy a cow, the returns to cow rearing could be as high as you can get them. That would benefit the people with cows. It wouldn't solve the poverty trap. But increasing the prices once the beneficiaries have the cows, of course, will help.
Yeah, the suggestion was a complementary as well. So I'm gonna ask a question that came to my mind, and it's a little bit related to the first question, and then joined with a question that was in the chat. So these people are they're part of the BRAC program, right? So that means that these are, in a sense, you have searched to be part of BRAC, or you're interested. So these are more entrepreneurial people than the average. Can one say that?
No, because they don't select themselves into the program. It's BRAC who selects them. And the compliance is basically 100%, because you're giving them an asset which is worth a year worth of income. Nobody says no to that.
Okay. So one of the questions that were asked in the chat was, have we assumed the knowledge skills as the same for people above and below the threshold? And if yes, why is that?
They were all given the same training. So none of them had a cow to start with. And everybody was given the same cow and the same training. So I think, yes, we can safely assume that they have the same skills. None of them were in self-employment before, and basically 93% of these women are illiterate. Mm-hmm. So there's no difference in education either.
And just a quick follow-up on that. So they wouldn't have worked as wage workers on the big animal farms either. They wouldn't have experienced that way.
So yes, but the same above and below the threshold.
Martina, maybe we should try Albert one more time. He still has his hand on.
Okay, I'm going to try Albert one more time. unmuting you now. So Albert, if you're there, you can try to talk. We can hear you doing something with your mic, so please, I think it might work. No. Okay.
Can you email me the question?
Yeah, you can email the question to Oriana.
I'll try to email it.
No. Sorry, it didn't. There's something that is not working. So I'm gonna, yes, email the question to Oriana and you're gonna get a reply to it. The last, we're gonna end this, unless someone in the panel, but there was a question that is a good question to end the seminar with, is to what extent are these findings generalizable? And what major variables are needed to be accounted for when trying to apply these findings to various other contexts?
I think these findings are generalizable. Of course, I can't prove it until I get to evaluate something like this in a completely different setting. But the fundamental, the fundamental criterion that you need for this to be applicable to other settings is two things. One, that the distribution of talent is uncorrelated with wealth at birth. Mm-hmm. And two, that there are barriers to entry into the best schools, into any level of education. So if we believe that both of these things are true, and they're certainly true of many societies that I know of, then the chances that a one-off investment can make a long-run difference are quite high.
Thanks, Oriana. So as Manny said, this is an impressive amount of work for a very long time, major sample, and following them with very little attrition is just incredibly interesting. Thank you so much. And for everyone listening, Oriana is going to be available at her Zoom room to talk with anyone interested for 30 minutes starting now. And you find the link to the Zoom room in the chat where we posted it. Thank you so much, and wishing everyone happy holidays, including Oriana. And we hope to see you all on the 2nd of March when we resume for another seminar series with the VDEV CPR. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.